blast off in my time machine. Third eye feeling like an Evazine. Blast off, blast off, blast off, blast off. Come blast off in my time machine. Third eye feeling like an Evazine. Blast off, blast off, blast off, blast off.
Hello everyone, this is Ryan, the original outlaw of the airwaves, bringing you a VIP episode of HEROparanormal podcast. Coming to you from the base of La Madre Mountain in the Mojave Desert, south of Area 51. If you haven't checked out HEROparanormal.com, please do. Drop $1 or more a month and become a patron. Boom. You just entered a special club of very few individuals helping me pay for websites, podcasting fees, costs, and more. Plus, you begin to get patron-only episodes for $1. Also, if you want to donate just once and not worry about the monthly recurring, I get that. Just donate once, then hit cancel. You're done. It's that easy. But I must warn you, we are the best deal in the game, in my opinion, with solid content. $8 a month gets you the rabbit hole, premium content, and insider information. Well, sometimes in this amazing existence called life, we see things that closely resemble us, yet don't. We see lights, anomalies, ghost-like apparitions, and we see things our minds tell us shouldn't be there. Or should they? Society tells us they don't exist, whether we see them or not. Bigfoot is possibly the most iconic of these. The new book, Where the Footprints End: High Strangeness and the Bigfoot Phenomenon, by Joshua Cutchin and Timothy Renner, is an absolute must-read and is changing the game of cryptozoology. With no further ado, Joshua Cutchin, welcome to the HEROparanormal podcast.
Hey, I'm doing all right. How's it sound on your end?
It sounds pretty good.
Good, awesome.
Hey, my man, I can't thank you enough for coming on and joining me to discuss like one of my favorite topics. The artwork in the book is so cool too. Did you happen to do that yourself?
No, that's Timothy Renner's work. Yeah,
that's amazing.
In the Bigfoot book.
Yep.
Yeah, that's Tim Renner.
Yep. Well, I got.
He brings. So some people are always like, oh, I want when's the ebook coming out? When's the ebook coming out? I'm like, folks, you don't want the ebook. You want this.
No, you want the hardcover.
Because I think that like there's probably a good 7 or 8 illustrations that you don't get in the ebook that you get in the physical book.
Oh,
so yeah,
it's amazing, and they're really cool. The cover too the creativity is just, it's amazing. If it's okay, I'd like to read a review of Where the Footprints End. Is that okay?
If you'd like to read a review of it?
Yeah. It's just, it's great. Okay, let me pull it up here. I think this is the most accurate review, too. It is...
All right. Is it the one that says it sucks?
No. It's great. It's actually, let's see. It is by Greg Newkirk.
Oh, yeah. He had great kind of things to say. I really appreciate that. He's a great guy.
Yeah, it's okay. So the review is, this book poses a danger to the foundations of cryptozoology. While mainstream Bigfoot investigators would have you believe that people around the world are merely encountering a lost ape, Cutchin and Renner dig into the details they've swept under the rug, excavating countless Bigfoot reports involving glowing orbs, telepathic communication, and paranormal phenomena that have more in common with tales of ancient gods and alien abductions than they do with primatology. Meticulously researched and backed up with a treasure trove of footnotes. Man, is that true? Where this is such a great review. It's amazing. Joshua, like, what got you down this path to writing this book?
Well, I've always had interest in like a bunch of things, and Bigfoot has always been sort of my number one love affair in the paranormal. So, I started writing books. My other books were about, food in the paranormal and smells in the paranormal, and the most recently before this, supernatural child abduction. I actually, this book was not my idea at all. It was my co-author Timothy Renner's. I remember I was actually at the beach, and I was getting ready to have my twins were getting ready to be born in a couple of months, and I said, I'm not going to write anything else because my life's going to get too crazy. And Tim phones me up and says, I want to do the definitive guide to weird Bigfoot. And I'm like, okay. So I cranked out as much of it as I could, as quickly as I could. Having said that, there is still the second volume that's coming out, but I have a real sympathy towards paranormal ideas, unified field theories of the paranormal, those sort of things. In my research and sort of my research into these topics, I've very much landed on the fact that the modern UFO contact experience is almost completely identical to the fairy contact experience, especially fairy contact experiences that you would see in Western Europe. I would argue worldwide they have a lot of similarities, but especially those Western European ones. And I got to the point where I said, I can pretty much find anything in alien abduction lore I can find some precedent for in fairy lore, and that's been very true. That's kind of what Thieves in the Night was. My third book about the child abduction was me trying to work out some of those ideas. Like, well, if this is this congruous between the fairy lore and the alien lore, if it's this congruous, then what about these other things that I had a hard time fitting in? I'm like, oh no, they actually do fit, especially if you turn your head and squint a little bit. But so where I was if the fairy lore is connected to the alien lore, and you have the realm of the dead connected to fairy lore, and the realm of the dead is connected, believe it or not, in some modern alien abduction stories, and Bigfoot is seen alongside UFOs in some cases, like the famous Pennsylvania flats in the 1970s. If there is some sort of unified field theory, like, how does this work? And that's really where all my interests have always lain, is in looking at the consistencies between these sort of ideas. It's not in any individual account's veracity that really attracts me to these topics. It's the consistency between accounts. So I don't know if this person is telling the truth, and I don't know if this person from the Belgian Congo is telling the truth, but their accounts are separated by 50 years, and they're describing the exact same behavior from these entities. So that, to me, suggests that there's some sort of objective reality behind that. And that's what I find really interesting. So this first volume, again, I said it's one of two, really does try to draw a lot of threads between things that we wouldn't necessarily perceive being related to Bigfoot at all. I think it's pretty clear to me that whatever we're dealing with, Bigfoot is a wild man archetype that we as a modern society have sort of skinned onto, or sort of layered onto this phenomena. So, comparing that to alien lore and fairy folklore and ghost lore and ritual magic and witches and this great women in white connection that Tim Renner found, it's been the gift that keeps on giving, because there are these similarities, things that you see in alien encounters that you also see in some Bigfoot encounters that get underreported. So just shining a light on that. It's a long-winded way to say shining a light on that has always been really appealing to me, and Tim's the one who sort of gave me the push over the edge to actually make that leap.
Yeah, and I wish I could have had Tim on as well, but maybe next time. I want to get to that Pennsylvania case as well. Is that the Delta, Pennsylvania, and the Cooper Road story?
Well, I mean, so if you look at the sort of, I believe it was early to mid 70s time in Pennsylvania, especially the work of Stan Gordon up there, was just getting what seems like, if you look back at some of his books, especially Silent Invasion, it seems like he was getting case after case after case of people seeing anomalous lights in the sky and sometimes structured craft in these large hairy hominids, either in close proximity or in conjunction with or immediately after these other sightings. And, Bigfoot appears alongside UFOs in a handful of other accounts as well. I would hesitate to say that it's a common thing, but I would definitely say that it occurs too frequently to be ignored. And unfortunately, the attitude in modern cryptozoology is that it should be ignored, because we all know that Bigfoot must be just some sort of, relatively mundane ape or missing link. And I think there's ample evidence to push back on that. I think the case that you're referring to, the big case that opens up the book, is the Fayette County, Pennsylvania case, where they shoot the tracer. There's this big ball of light that comes down in the field, and they shoot tracer rounds at the Bigfoot.
That's the one. So
this is sort of like the case from that era in terms of just combining up all the high strangeness. There was this gentleman by the name of George Kowalczyk, and he recalled seeing this large ball of light land on his father's farm. And they go up there, and there's this giant orb that's just glowing. And as they go out to the field, they see these there's this whistling sound, and they hear these two large dark shapes with arms extending below their knees, and if there's this thing walking in the glow of this giant orb, and it looks like this giant hairy man thing. They shoot these tracer rounds at it, so that means they can actually see the round, because they're illuminated as being tracer rounds. And even when they were sure that they hit them, and it would just make this sound like dropping a bullet into the water. And that's kind of the main narrative that you hear in a lot of these books, because this case has been talked about ad nauseum. Tim did a great job of digging up some further research. Once Stan Gordon arrived on the scene, the glowing orb was gone. It was still bright enough that he said you could read a newspaper in the center of the landing site. But also, one of the witnesses just went completely deranged, and claimed to have these visions. This was the gentleman I was talking about, Kowalczyk. And he was having these apocalyptic visions of sort of the end of the world and the sort of Grim Reaper thing. And the story just keeps on getting weirder and weirder, because the aftermath is just as odd. He claimed that he didn't need his glasses anymore after having this apocalyptic vision, after seeing UFO and Bigfoot. And he was visited by some people, some individuals who sort of had a Men in Black sort of role. They told him that he should, look into this very, much further. It's a very strange story, and it sort of is the litmus test for which all this other weird phenomena seems to conglomerate. And it's interesting. There are some people who have said that Bigfoot, for the hunter who sees Bigfoot, walking through a forest while they're out hunting deer, yes, it does seem like a large hairy primate. There's no reason to suspect otherwise. But for people who have longitudinal interactions with these things on their property, the people that we would call habituators, they tend to describe things that sound a lot stranger and tend to resonate with things like poltergeist phenomena and hauntings. Sometimes seeing completely separate entities, other than Bigfoot in the same area. Some people claim that, who are long-term habituators, or to have seen, these Sasquatch that appear in the rooms of their house, and just sort of fade away and disappear. And, obviously not everyone is equally credible, but the number of stories that we found going through the research for this book, the number of stories where there was something weird, but it got, as Tim likes to say, weird washed. Like they took just the stuff that makes it sound like a big hairy ape and threw out the weird stuff. It happened time and again. There are two famous cases that I can think of off the top of my head. One, of course, is Ape Canyon, which nobody has necessarily really gone out of their way to deny some of the stranger aspects of that seminal encounter. But at the same time, you hear it in almost every documentary about Bigfoot, and they never talk about the weird stuff ever. And then another one is this case out of Oregon that I talk about in the book that, basically it describes, you could take the narrative out of this particular newspaper article and drop it into a newspaper in 1812 in Ireland, and everybody would be like, oh yeah, it's a fairy story, except it's a fairy story with a giant 12-foot pie, man monster covered in fur. I found that same story in another book about large hairy hominids, and they take all the weird stuff out, which is, in this case, involved unearthly music, this weird domed, illuminated layer of the creature, and this female captive who comes up and says, flee now, for your life depends on it. It's this interconnected web, just in absolute confusion. But the thing that really becomes clear is that these sort of motifs and ideas dovetail and go back and forth. They tend to cross-pollinate a lot.
I love your comment that is used in the book about consider the company that these things keep, because, it's interesting that you go into detail with the glowing orb. I don't know if I'm going to go against a BFRO NDA or not. I'm going to tread very carefully here, but to not go into any detail, myself and another researcher saw something on an expedition. Moments later, a father and a son saw something, and then they saw a glowing orb. And because they saw the glowing orb, the entire sighting that they had moments later was completely discounted. They took me and the other researcher aside and separated us and got our information, and they told the father and son, sorry, well, maybe next time.
Yeah, it's weird. Like these things, in terms of the company they keep, like that's something I told Tim a long time ago, because we were talking about, I have a real soft spot for taking these things at cryptozoological face value in terms of being what we all thought they were as kids, right? Like, so Bigfoot is a relic hominid, and the Loch Ness monster is a plesiosaur. But then you look at the fact that, Loch Ness and that surrounding area has some really strange occult activity. It's in an area that I would say is not. It's certainly not a UFO dead zone. I'd say that. And then you look at the fact too that none other than Aleister Crowley set up Boleskine House on the shores of Loch Ness, and I'm like, oh, that sounds like this might be something a little bit more occulted than just a relic species of dinosaur or something. And I love those ideas. They're romantic, and I think that cryptozoology is a truly useful discipline that should be recognized for the powerful tool that it is. I mean, I'm literally waiting any day now for us to have solid proof that there's still a breeding population of thylacine in Australia, the Tasmanian tiger, because there's such good photographic and sort of secondary evidence for the existence of them. And that's truly, I think, where cryptozoology should be putting all its effort forward. But, if you're trying to work backwards from the idea that we're dealing with giant, monkeys, and then you have to try to retroactively fit glowing balls of light in there, I think that's sort of a fool's errand. And stories like that really underscore the fact that these things get really weird really quick.
Yes, and I totally understand what the BFRO and other organizations are up against, because they're already kind of trying to bring science into a fringe area where they just want to stick to the facts, ma'am, type mentality, yet they go, some reports are just not even classified. It's such a gray area, and I think it's interesting that you there is a chapter, and I'm going to mess this word up. I know I am. So maybe you can help me, Joshua. Wildness.
Die Wildnisgeist, yeah. I think that this is a problem that we've seen in ufology too, which is this idea that they just want to sit at the big kids table in the lunchroom. And I made an argue in a collection of essays from back in 20, oh Lord, I guess it was probably 2017 now. It was, basically this idea that we shouldn't shy away from the weird parts of these stories, because science is getting weirder and weirder by the day. I mean, come on, anybody who follows any sort of science magazine in their social media feed knows science is saying stuff that if it came from, Richard C. Hoagland or somebody, one of the fringier kind of people in a lot of these topics, like, we would laugh at it. But it's coming from CERN, and they're saying that they see a dimension that moves backwards. Okay, that makes sense. So not only that, but also, there's this robust, strong tradition that's really pulling the rug out from underneath the materialist, physicalist paradigm. And I think that is no better illustrated than in the work of people like Dean Radin and Daryl Bem and some of these other consciousness researchers who are really at the bleeding edge of this. But, to circle back around to that, the term that you mentioned, Wildnisgeist, it occurred to me a while back, keeping that sort of, the company these things keep sort of mindset. that there were a lot of cases on things like the BFRO website that are Class B reports, which are things that people attribute to Bigfoot, but they don't see at Bigfoot. So we're talking about, strange voices in the forest, strange smells, rocks and limbs being thrown at you, hearing wood knocks, seeing footprints, seeing handprints, gifts being left behind. And it occurred to me that in the absence of Sasquatch, if you take all those things and put them into a house, you've got a poltergeist case. Like, those are all 100% hallmarks of poltergeist case. We think of poltergeist as being, rattling cupboards and banging dishes, and while that is something that happens, a lot of the time the things that manifest are, strange reports, which find precedent in Bigfoot lore with these gifts. Also, rocks materializing and falling from the ceiling inside that are warm to the touch. Well, a lot of these rocks that people get hit with in Bigfoot, these Bigfoot Class B sightings, are also warm to the touch, but people assume it's Bigfoot holding them in their hand. Well, it's also, like I said, a hallmark of poltergeist activity. Smells, strange voices, footprints, knocks especially. I mean, the two places that you'd find poltergeists were around, are generally around an adolescent who typically is going through some sort of trauma or, is pubescent and is sort of coming into puberty, or you find them in seances. And the chief means of communicating with a medium in a seance was by knocking, knocking on, the walls or knocking or rapping on the table. And then you couple that, too, with the fact that these poltergeists that were seen in these seances sometimes had physical forms that manifested as large, hairy ape men. So it seems to me that we're kind of describing two sets of phenomena, and the only thing that's really different is the setting. So, I don't think anybody has really ever talked about the possibility of there being, like, a poltergeist that exists outside of a house. So for me, I thought that the idea of Wildnisgeist, from poltergeist is noisy, noisy ghost, geist, or spirit. I thought Wildnisgeist, wilderness spirit, might be a fitting term for these phenomena because, look, people have seen Bigfoot vocalizing, and they've seen them throwing stones, and they've seen them in conjunction with bad smells, and they've seen them, in conjunction with a lot of stuff. So I'm not saying that isn't the case sometimes, but at the same time, if you didn't see Bigfoot do it, you don't know Bigfoot did it. So it's just trying to get people to think in different ways. I think if people would go through the book chapter by chapter expecting some sort of grand thesis where we all tie it together, we can't, because, whatever this phenomena is shares so many attributes so closely with a lot of different other folk traditions that it really isn't possible to nail anything down. The only conclusion that we really reach, honestly, and of course it's split. I mean, if we have any true sense of conclusions, they're going to come in book 2. But so it's split kind of a little bit arbitrarily after the Women in White chapter. But the main conclusion that we have, and I've talked to Tim about this numerous times, is that we just don't know. But if you are intellectually honest about a lot of this data, it seems to push you farther away from the wood ape hypothesis. Which, look, I mean, I grew up a monster kid. I want them to capture Bigfoot. Like, that sounds great. But if I'm looking at all this body of evidence and how even some of these mundane stories have these things that were attributed to witches or to fairies or to hairy ghosts back in other centuries, it makes me wonder if we're not dealing with something a little bit more literally paranormal. I hated the idea of paranormal Bigfoot at one point, but the more I looked at it, I'm like, oh, this is actually kind of, in its own way, semi-explicative. I know that explaining one unknown with another unknown is problematic in and of itself, but if 60 plus, 70 plus years of looking for a large hairy hominid in North America doesn't do the trick, then maybe we ought to try a different angle in terms of how we interrogate these topics.
And Joshua, I think you're right. Like, there's no 100% conclusion, but the consistencies are remarkable. And those simple numbers, I wanted to get into the Gald and Cornell, the generalities of poltergeist activity and Bigfoot, and just how these things are 100 times more active at night. Like, it goes through like 64% of the cases, manipulation of small objects, 58% peaked after nightfall, 48% involved those rapping sounds. It's pretty interesting stuff.
Yeah, it was a study. I think, to my knowledge, it's probably the largest study in terms of studying poltergeist phenomena in terms of the data set that they used. They took a look at about 170 years worth of cases. Like you said, it's all things that you would expect of Bigfoot phenomena. There's an increased amount of activity at night. There are a lot of, almost half the cases involve these rapping sounds, which in Bigfoot lore are wood knocks. For some reason, Bigfoot likes to bang on trees or bang rocks together or make these knocking sounds. But it's the exact same form of spirit communication that you find in these seances and in these poltergeist cases. Moving heavy furniture. There was a case from Snellgrove Lake, Canada, where an individual had a cabin that was up there filming for the Monster Quest TV series, and they actually had the cabin ransacked, and this was an area with a lot of Bigfoot activity. It's oddly enough, the moment that they decide to leave for a while, something moves in and just tears the entire cabin apart. Now, of course, that could be like primatological behavior or something like a bear going through the house, but still, that's the kind of thing that you would expect from a poltergeist infestation too, is wrecking the furniture.
Now, something that the original, something really interesting that Ron Moorhead, in your book, you mentioned Alan Berry and Ron Moorhead recording a series of peculiar vocalizations. They're known as the Sierra Sounds, and they involve disembodied voices. Could we go into that a little bit?
Yeah, so this book owes a large debt to, obviously Ron Moorhead is a great researcher in his own right, but the Ann Slate and Al Berry book, Bigfoot, which is out of print, but has a bunch of like weird, really strange Bigfoot stories. Some of them are too long to actually make it into either of our books. But Al Berry and Ron Moorhead were in the Sierra Nevada mountains, and they would leave a microphone behind. And in several instances, they got what sounded like voices, and the most up-close voices are really guttural and odd and strange. I do an impression. I don't know if we want to do that, but they've been sort of, you can find them online if you just do Bigfoot Sierra Sounds, and they've been sort of referred to as sort of samurai chatter. And there are some individuals who used to be Navy linguistics experts who have come in and said, these frequencies, their overtones, etc., that shouldn't be able to be manufactured by the human voice tract, by the human vocal cords. Basically, he came through with a spectral analysis that said this shouldn't be producible by a human without any sort of, augmentation. But it is this really animalistic, guttural, vaguely Asiatic sort of speech pattern, which is why people call it the samurai chatter case. But Colin Wilson said of the voices that people hear in poltergeist cases, he said they don't sound like ordinary human voices, at least not at first. He says they start sounding guttural and as if it's made up from animalistic sort of grunts and groans. And that's exactly what is captured on the Sierra Nevada, the Sierra Sounds tapes. So again, it's just one of those things. I'm less, I think that all the things that I described in that Wildnisgeist chapter, I think they are coming from some sort of large hairy ape. I just think that large hairy ape sometimes is somehow tied into the poltergeist phenomena, rather than saying it's just poltergeist in the woods. But some of these similarities are just astounding.
Amazing stuff. So I guess wrapping up for our non-patron listeners, and I think it's great how the book really keeps tempo with like tongue-in-cheek humor while delving deeply into the phenomenon. And as an example, can we discuss like the hairy fairies and modern fairy cases like the Little Foot or Little Feet or Little Footprints?
Little Footprints or Little Footprints. Yeah, so, it's interesting. People would say, you can't even begin to, number one, fairies don't exist, which on the surface of that comment, I would tend to agree, but I think that what fairy lore was describing is absolutely dialed into almost every aspect of the paranormal you'll ever find. I think that there's a strong case to be made that if you wanted to approach the paranormal with a fairy lore lens, not only just again Western Europe, but also worldwide, which shares a lot of commonalities. I think you'd be hard pressed to find anything that really falls outside of that sort of mythology in and of itself. But the stumbling block that people have is that fairies are traditionally little people, so how does a large hairy monkey act like a fairy. Well, setting aside the robust number of similarities in terms of their behavior, fairies didn't have to be small. The term fairy is really a catch-all for things that include mermaids and pixies and giants and ogres and trolls and also elves and the wee folk and all these, basically all these different. It's like a Pokemon catalog. I've described it as in the past. And not only that, but fairies could also shapeshift. I mean, there's a tale of an Icelandic changeling who, in the story, in the folk story, it stretches so it's wakes up in the middle of the night when its parents are asleep, and it stretches so hard that it actually reaches it reaches the rafters as it stretches. So the idea that fairies have to be small is a real misnomer. And then once you start digging into the similarities, I mean, the number of little people that were described as being short and hairy. I mean, anything that's sort of a goblin variant. And by goblin variant, I mean, hobgoblins, brownies. I think Peckemderlin was another sort of variant. You'll find these similarities throughout folklore. These fairies being described as short little people with hairy bodies and monkey faces, or at least wizened, wrinkled faces, which could describe a monkey face as well. So it seems to me there's some similarity there, especially when you consider that people in modern America, claim to have seen Littlefoot, which is depending on your own personal ideas, it's either a little Bigfoot, like an adolescent Bigfoot, or it's a subspecies. Sometimes you see them together. And, that could very well be the case, but the number of fairy descriptions, and people still encounter fairies, literally through to this day. People say that, in everywhere from the woods to, rooftop gardens in London, people are still seeing these things. I don't know how much stock I put in those stories, but some of these descriptions still describe these little hairy people. And you couple that shape-shifting idea with the idea that some people have seen Bigfoot disappear and shape-shift and all these crazy things. And it sort of lives a little bit of extra strength to the fairy folk hypothesis. I mean, people say Bigfoot lives underground, and fairyland was oftentimes depicted as being underground. People used to say that if your horse was in the stable with its mane all tangled and woven together, that it was the fairies who came in, or the witches who came in the middle of the night and braided these manes. And there are flesh and blood Bigfooters who claim now that if you find your horse in its stable overnight, it was the Bigfoot braiding horses' manes. So there's a lot of these things that have carried over from the older body of folklore, and we're just grafting them onto this Bigfoot phenomenon. I think that's pretty, in my case, in my sense at least, that's relatively obvious that this is at least part of what's going on. And you look at some of these words. I mean, there are some Bigfoot variants of some First Nations tribes here in America that are literally Bigfoot analogs that are talked about in scholarly fairy folklore. So the idea that Bigfoot couldn't possibly be fairies is sort of, if we're already down the Bigfoot route, why not try to encompass the full, spectrum of weirdness? The other thing that really baffled me is, we tend to think of, the lion's share of Bigfoot prints being, five-toed footprints, and I think that's true. I think most of them are. Volume 2 is going to go into things like disappearing trackways and oddly numbered toes on these footprints. That's what I found interesting, is that, after 5 toes, the most common thing is these 3-toed footprints.
I'm truly so fascinated by the Bigfoot phenomenon, and, 3 toes, 5 toes, who knows? There's so many different variants, like you said. Yeah, the tracks are amazing, and I'm glad that you mentioned the story of the fairy, the Icelandic fairy, because fae in general is just so misunderstood. Everybody just goes right to Tinkerbell and way off topic. And that kind of brings me to another hairy fairy, or the hairy extraterrestrials. And I wanted to touch really quickly on something that kind of made me laugh, which is the, let's see here, Linda Moulton Howe's 1980 documentary Strange Harvest, popularizing the idea extraterrestrials caused unexplained livestock mutilations, but there was basically the idea that it represented a fairy slaughter. But then, it's really not a funny topic, because hairy hominids worldwide allegedly kill every type of livestock, and that's kind of what you go into.
Yeah, no, the livestock mutilation thing, we tend to think, being involved in these circles, that there's something of a UFO monopoly on that, and I tend to see quite the opposite. I think it's one of these these interdisciplinary topics, and so obviously there's this sort of meme in ufology that, as good as Linda's work was, has sort of taken on a life of its own about, aliens plucking up cows and reaming out their soft tissue with surgical precision to somehow monitor something for some purpose. Anyone who's really interested in the cattle, the unexplained livestock mutilation phenomena, I would recommend to pick up "Stalking the Herd" by Chris O'Brien. He does an excellent job of sort of trying to separate the hysteria from the facts, and arrives at, kind of where I arrive in a lot of stuff dealing with the paranormal, is that a lot of this is mundane, some of it is secret, and then there's a significant portion that's just completely unexplainable. But a lot of people don't know this. So, everybody knows about the cattle mutilation meme amongst ufology, but they don't realize that anybody, an Irish farmer who would see a cow dead in his field would at some point have said, "Oh, that's a harvest for the fairies. I'm going to leave it to them. I'm not going to bother them with it." And the number of animals that Bigfoot or large hairy hominids have claimed to kill are just astonishing. I mean, chickens, cattle, goats, horses, rabbits, and yaks. You add to this fact something else that I find really interesting. Another cattle-related similarity between fairies, aliens, and Bigfoot is a lack of milk from someone's cows. Actually, and witches too, while we're at it. Again, I would argue to say fairy cultures the world over, if your cow didn't give milk, in any culture that had a belief of little people, it was generally assumed that the little people came along and drained your cow of milk. This was especially a prevalent belief in the British Isles. Similarly, that also got passed along to witches, the idea that witches would steal cows' milk. Then there are plenty of stories where cows who don't give milk are blamed on, UFO sightings above the ranch. Either the UFOs literally took the milk, or the cows were too frightened to milk. And then there is a really strange subset of stories that people don't talk about of Bigfoot suckling livestock, like Bigfoot getting a cow into a choker hold and sucking milk out of its udder. Which I don't know if I believe any one of those stories, but the idea of how it fits into this larger framework of how we've described these anomalies in the past, I think is really interesting. The fact that you have all these different things that can supposedly, de-milk a cow, is just really, really wild.
Milk and cows, and there's a lot of superstition. And I think that's kind of the path I like, that these are, the witches and, the aliens plucking up cows and monitoring. And this is all can be attributed, just depending on the time period, to different things. And the Fae lore really tends to really grab and popularize that, at least in ancient times. I wanted to get into, Joshua, a little bit of God's ape, Christian demonology, the myth of the wild man, and among Pan, known for rousing from naps with a shout and drunken behavior. I thought that was so cool.
Yeah, this is so. Part of the reason that I actually did there's that meme of Charlie Day from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, where he's got this giant web of conspiracy theories lining his wall, and I actually did a similar one trying to trace this wild man archetype. So it is generally accepted fact amongst folklorists, in a very unambiguous, uncontroversial way, that to begin with, you had something like the satyrs and the fauns, the half-man, half-goat creatures like Pan, in other words. And they were sort of the emissaries of Dionysus or Bacchus, depending on whether you want to go the Roman or the Greek route. It's part of the reason, as you mentioned, the reason that people would... The word panic comes from this sense of being lost in the woods, and the idea was that, it it was the god Pan injecting this artificial fear into you. That panic is like a term for an actual artificial fear impulse. Now, of course, satyrs and fauns, and Pelosi's and Sylvestris, if you want to sort of go into other names for these creatures, these half-man, half-goat creatures, obviously fall under the fairy folklore umbrella. They're sort of pagan genus loci, but they're associated with Dionysus and Bacchus. What happened is you had Christianity come in and, obviously demonize a lot of these pagan entities while also sort of wanting to incorporate them. So the satyrs and the fauns, that sort of half-man, half-goat imagery, was appropriated for Satan, which is, a very popular image. But it's very much accepted fact amongst folklorists that these satyr and faun archetypes tie directly into an evolution of the wild man archetype. So what was once satyrs and fauns, these half-men, half-goats, sort of transformed over time into hairy men / hairy half-man, half-ape sort of creatures that lived in the forest. At the same time, on a separate tangent, you have Dionysus, who's often depicted as this god with what they call a foliate motif, so like this vegetation around its head. And if you've ever seen, once you see it once, you'll see it time and again, the Green Man image. And you'll find a lot of times in architecture, honestly, the world over, it literally is an archetype because it appears in, civilizations that didn't have any contact. It sort of emerges independently on its own. But you'll find it even in a lot of Christian churches in Europe, this idea of like the wild man of the woods. The wild man of the woods was conflated with Dionysus. The wild man of the woods was the Wadrose. Wadrose takes a lot of inspiration from the Norse god Odin as well. And Odin combined with the wild man, and I've read this numerous times. Yes, like there's the Christian Saint Nicholas rather. There's a Christian Saint Nicholas, but that name was largely conflated with this wild man archetype, this wild man Odinic archetype. So you end up getting Santa Claus. I mean, that's the reason that, I'm sure Odin had an 8-legged horse named Sleipnir, and that's why Santa has 8 tiny reindeer, drying, elves who make toys and drying mushrooms in stockings beside your tree for psychedelic effects. There's a whole rabbit hole that you can go down in that direction. But so I say all that to say that once there was this conflation of these these emissaries of Dionysus with the devil and with demons, you sort of have this outgrowth of exactly what he called God's ape, which sometimes literally meant that, the forces of mankind's lesser nature were depicted as apes, but it also meant God's ape in terms of like, the devil was aping what God was trying to do. He was trying to imitate what God was trying to do. It becomes increasingly difficult if you look through these older texts to separate out, what a forest demon was versus what a wild man was. And it very much seems like, in the case of, say, that there's an anecdote in the book from an older text of 2 missionaries who are traveling through these mountains in France to convert a region, and they're pelted with stones by a demon of the forest. Well, between being pelted with stones and saying a demon of the forest with all this other baggage, it sounds like they're describing a large hairy man creature. And you see this cropping up even in, modern place names today, like the number of places that have devil in their name that are associated with Bigfoot, and the number of times people call them mountain devils or swamp devils or wood devils, etc., is pretty startling. But so apes became sort of shorthand for sinning. There's a sculpture of the fall of man in the Garden of Eden, and it's like, it's Adam, Eve, the serpent, and there's also an ape hanging out there too. So yeah, there's this association with the apes being something that were low and base and represented mankind's animalistic nature. And you see all these things sort of combined in some ways with the story of the Traverse Spine gorilla, which was basically a Bigfoot sighting in Labrador, Canada. But the thing about it was that even though it had a bunch of credible witnesses, including a doctor associated with the case, these Bigfoot left behind cloven footprints that they described as the size of like a large ox. So it's it becomes like so many of these things really difficult to separate all these different influences out. But the idea that those older ideas are not somehow influencing what we see today is I think a little bit short-sighted.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, so interesting that the woman in white and Bigfoot on the battlefield was also something you mentioned in the book, getting into some of the stranger aspects of where this headed, and where do these two things merge? And I mean, the book goes into great detail, but for those that haven't read it, could you just give them like a quick rundown?
Yeah, so basically, the entire project is divided into two books. The first one of which is folklore. Again, there's folklore in volume 2, and there's evidence in volume 1. But we tried to find some way to separate this arbitrarily. So, volume 1 looks at how a lot of the things reported in Bigfoot lore tie back into folklore, and volume 2 looks at the anomalous evidence. So, like these ending trackways, these oddly numbered toe prints, things like visual recordings of odd lights around Bigfoot. So it's kind of all it's an arbitrary place to separate it. But we track. I think you could say that this book covers window areas, poltergeists, and aliens and fairies and ghosts and witches and a little bit of ritual magic and this woman in white archetype, all filtered through the frame of the Bigfoot phenomenon. The woman in white thing I thought was complete BS when Tim came to it, because it's completely Tim's baby, Tim's idea. I'm about 98% sure that he's the first person to ever make this connection, because I'd never heard of it, and I thought he was really barking up the wrong tree. But he found an odd number of cases where people who saw Bigfoot either saw Bigfoot in conjunction with an anomalous woman in white, or he found people seeing Bigfoot at sites of like ponds that have this woman in white character who's dying by the edge of a pond. Again, if you into ghost hunting at all, like the woman in white, the woman in gray, the woman in green, the woman in black, like there are all these different sort of like ghost archetypes. Yeah, every castle has their lady in gray. Like, get over it. But seems to be a special affinity for these white women women in white, not white women. That sounds a little bit different. These women in white and Bigfoot, and also just this white color. The thing that, and again, as I said, this is Tim's baby, so I'm trying not to butcher it. But the thing that really blew it open for Tim was that there's a Teutonic moon goddess whose name was, depending on the region, either Bertha or Perkta, and her retinue. She had very large feet, so that checks off the Bigfoot idea. And her retinue was comprised of two factions. One of them were the Heimchen, which were the spirits of abandoned children who appeared as these glowing orbs of light, as will-o'-the-wisps, which we see in the context of Bigfoot sightings the world over. And also the other component were the Perkten, I believe, which were a group of wild men who, in some cultures, especially in Eastern Europe, they're depicted as being sort of Krampus-like, which brings us all the way back around to that fallen satyr sort of thing as well. But yeah, she was this woman in white who was following. Or rather was followed by anomalous lights and, big, hairy wild men. So I think that sort of speaks for itself. And then, Tim has a lot of anecdotes, not only from people he's talked to, but some other cases as well, of there being these women in white that are seen in really strange circumstances. There's an anecdote that he tells from the Sasquatch Chronicles podcast of this woman who looked like a homeless woman who was always dressed in white, who had these large, oversized feet, and who was appearing at the same time. These two brothers were having some really, not only violent, but sort of really strange Bigfoot activity around their house. And at one point, the woman just vanished in front of their eyes after they confronted her, and all sorts of stuff. But if you look at, spots of, heavy Bigfoot activity. You have, Gettysburg Battlefield, which has plenty of Bigfoot stories predating the war, and women in white stories after the war. Similarly, Chickamauga National Park, which is the battlefield in North Georgia, has post-battle had a woman in white specter who supposedly was carrying a torch, looking for her failed lover, while at the same time there was, predating the battlefield even, according to some sources, this ghoulish, hair-covered monster that also prowled the battlefield as well, and was seen post-war gobbling up the corpses of Confederate soldiers, and has been seen since then at that battle site, as well as the white lady in white as well. But a lot of this sort of comes to a head in that Ape Canyon story, which I alluded to earlier, which is, if anybody isn't familiar, Ape Canyon is often trotted out as this, like, exemplary story of what Bigfoot can do, and it's the story about these miners who showed up at this prospecting site outside of Mount St. Helens and were basically besieged by Bigfoot for an evening. Bigfoot are reaching their hands through the holes in the cabin, and they're shooting through the slats in the cabin, trying to drive the Bigfoot off, and they're throwing rocks and boulders at the cabin and all this stuff. And that's what you hear from most cryptozoological sources. What you don't hear is that Fred Beck, who led everybody there, he wasn't a theosophist, but he has a lot of things. He didn't have the Orientalist framing that a lot of theosophists adopted, but he did have a theosophical sort of bent in terms of the way that he thought about stuff, and he had anomalous events all through his childhood. The site that they were led to that caused the Ape Canyon attacks was actually he was actually pointed in the right direction by like this large Native American spirit, he said, that told him to follow this white arrow in the sky, which sounds like a UFO thing. Again, you've got that white quality too. And they named the mining claim after another female spirit guide of his named Vander White. So the white lady connotation is there too. And the Ape Canyon story has some outliers that are really strange. There was an apport of a pencil to Fred Beck's hand at one point in the cabin when he needed a pencil. He said it was a pencil from his home that just appeared in his hand. There was a low drumming sound that sounded like it was coming from underground around the Ape Canyon site. And there were also two Bigfoot prints that appeared in a sandbar that was about an acre wide in the middle of a river. And it looked like it was about 60 yards, I think. No footprints leading up to those two footprints or out of the sandbar. So unless you think Bigfoot can jump that high, that pushes your belief system for a large hairy hominid. Even one of the other guys in the claim, not Fred Beck, but another individual said, it was almost as if something had dropped whatever made these two giant footprints out of the sky and picked it back up, which sounds very UFO, sounds very spontaneously, manifesting.
But that is the way these things go. They're wild and crazy. And, this is interesting. Speaking of synchronicity, coincidence, etc., something you kind of go into in the book. I purchased a ranch south of the famous Utah UFO ranch. And I just got word while we're recording that a section of the buildings on the property just got struck by lightning and is on fire. So I guess I'm familiar with like the synchronicity, the supernatural synchronicity and the coincidence of bad luck. But I kind of wanted to go down we encounter some of those low drumming sounds underground up there and shapeshifters. And I wanted to go into shapeshifters and Moki and water babies, women in, the women in white thing is so strange, but it does seem to kind of have ties to these other things. And of course, skinwalkers.
Yeah. So, that drumming / noises from underground thing is really, I don't even know what to make of that. I mean, you can sort of turn your head sideways and squint and say it sounds like stories of, elves delving underground and all sorts of stuff like that. Also, underground bases and stuff like that you find in, modern UFO lore. Tim, he doesn't talk about it in the book, but he had a experience where he was communicating with something, leaving cairns back and forth, and he had one instance where he went down there and things were shifted in a way that they shouldn't have been, and he had this irrational fear hit him, and this like dead, decaying skunk smell hit him, and he just was paralyzed. I was like, okay, I've been asking for it, I'm going to see a Bigfoot. And then he heard these 3 clicks, he says, that were like gears clicking into place, and then everything was fine, and the fear left him completely. And you see these sort of stories, these like mechanical sounds coming out of nowhere. I mean, there are plenty of examples in that Al Berry and Slate book that I mentioned, Bigfoot, which we actually reference that in our book as well, but also in the stuff like Skinwalker Ranch. I have kind of a problem with the word Skinwalker because it feels like it's become something of like a catch-all. For a lot of these different phenomena, you saw a large wolf. Oh, it's a skinwalker. You saw a dog man. It's a skinwalker. You saw a man who just, an indigenous man who disappeared along the side of the road. Oh, it's skinwalker. Oh, you saw a large hairy hominid. It's a skinwalker. And I definitely get that. I definitely get that because these are people in Dene tradition who were attributed the powers of shape-shifting, but it almost seems like the way that people in, the 19th and 18th centuries would use the word fairy. Well, that's fairy. It's something weird happened. It's fairy. It's the fairies. It's that sort of thing. But at the same time, I can't ignore the fact that there are certain tribes that believe that Bigfoot is a de facto shapeshifter who was, once a human being who who sold their soul in some capacity to take on these supernatural abilities. The Nakani, there's some tribes around one of the large lakes in Canada. They call this their Bigfoot the Nakani, and that's exactly what they described it. There was another, some of the Yurok described the Omaha as a human being who left their tribe to sort of become devils, and that certainly lines up with the conflation of skinwalkers and large hairy hominids, as well. Talk a little bit more about shape-shifting in book 2, but that's something that people don't like to talk about, but it's also one of those things that has sort of found its way in even mundane ways into like traditional Bigfooting, because even people who are like flesh and blood Bigfooters say, oh yeah, they can stand really still and their hair ends up looking like the bark of a tree. Now, I mean, that may be the case, but that's a level of mimicry that is like sub-octopus level of mimicry, because you're not only changing, you might be changing the color of your hair, but you also like somehow your hair looks like bark. I mean, like I would buy Bigfoot looking like a clump of leaves before I'd buy that, because there's obviously the number of cases where people have said Bigfoot looks like somebody running around in a ghillie suit are, legion. So yeah, like I think that there's something to that Bigfoot skinwalker tradition. I have a hard time saying anything XYZ is a skinwalker. I can say that something necessarily resonates with skinwalker tradition, but I have a hard time putting a pin in it and saying, oh yeah, it was a skinwalker.
What a great point to make. I can't agree more. And I am going to just go ahead and start wrapping things up. Your creativity, the popularity of your new book, such a likable writing style. I can't thank you enough for all of the information and stories recounted in that book. Everybody should really get a copy. It's great. Where the Footprints End by Joshua Cutchin and Timothy Renner. You can go to joshuacutchin.com. You can also go to darkhollerarts.com, and the book is available on Amazon as well. Be sure to check the new volumes coming out in the near future and other works by Joshua Cutchin, and be sure to keep track of him on social media. You can find him at Joshua Cutchin at Facebook and joshuacutchin.com. Until next time, my friends, keep your eyes to the skies, feet on the ground, but don't forget to take a look around.
blast off in my time machine. Third eye feeling like an Evazine. Blast off, blast off, blast off, blast off. Come blast off in my time machine. Third eye feeling like an Evazine.